right, so today we're tackling microeconomics. Ready for a deep dive?
Absolutely. We're going to unpack how individuals and businesses, make decisions, especially when resources are limited. It's all about understanding those trade-offs and how markets function.
Sounds a little intimidating, but I'm ready to unlock those economic secrets. What are we diving into today?
Well, we've got a comprehensive set of notes on microeconomics. It covers all those fundamental concepts.
Perfect. Let's jump right in. Where should we start?
Well, let's kick things off with something everyone's familiar with, markets. Imagine a bustling farmer's market packed with people buying and selling.
Okay, I can picture it. All those fresh fruits, vegetables, homemade goods. But how does that relate to the economy as a whole?
It's a microcosm of the larger economy, really. You've got buyers with their needs and budgets and sellers trying to offer products that meet those needs while, making a profit. It's all about supply and demand.
Okay, supply and demand, those are like Econ 101.
Right. Exactly. Demand is all about the buyers, what they want, and how much they're willing to pay for it. Think about a hot new gadget like a smartphone. When it first hits the market, the demand is through the roof.
Yeah, everyone wants the latest and greatest, and they're willing to shell out the big bucks for it.
Right. And supply is the other side of the equation. It's about what sellers are offering and at what price. With that same smartphone, as more companies start producing similar models, supply goes up, and that eventually brings prices down.
So that's why those fancy gadgets become more affordable over time. It's all about competition and supply, catching up with that initial high demand.
You got it. To really grasp how supply and demand play out, we can visualize them using supply and demand curves. These curves capture that push and pull between buyers and sellers.
Right, the curves show how much people are willing to buy or sell at different prices.
Precisely. And the point where those two curves intersect, that's the equilibrium point.
Equilibrium. So what's so special about that point?
Equilibrium is where the quantity demanded by buyers matches the quantity supplied by sellers at a certain price. It's like a perfect balance where everyone's happy.
Like at our farmer's market example, when the price of apples is just right, everyone goes home satisfied.
Exactly. No surplus apples rotting away and no disappointed customers. That's equilibrium in action.
Sounds ideal. Why is this balance so crucial in economics?
It's all about efficiency, you see, maximizing benefits for both buyers and sellers. Think about it. If a product's price is way above equilibrium, lots of people get priced out, right? And then you end up with a surplus of unsold goods. But if the price is too low, demand explodes, creating shortages.
So equilibrium is like that sweet spot where the market operates at its best. Everyone's happy, and resources are used efficiently.
Precisely. It's like an unseen force guiding everything towards this balance. It's called the invisible hand.
An invisible hand. Sounds a little mystical. How does this force actually work?
It's all about self-interest, really. Individuals and businesses acting in their own best interest. Like with concert tickets, a show sells out quickly. That signals to organizers that maybe they could charge more next time. But if those higher prices result in empty seats, well, they'll adjust downwards next time. It's this constant push and pull that brings the market toward that equilibrium price.
So like a dance of self-interest that ends up benefiting everyone.
Exactly. And this price isn't just random. It has a few important roles: rationing, allocation, and information.
Break those down for us.
Well, rationing means prices help decide who gets access to limited things. If something's pricey, only those who can afford it get it. Allocation ensures things go to those who value them most, the ones willing to pay the most. And lastly, prices send signals about scarcity. High prices might mean the product's in short supply.
Amazing. It's like prices are a secret communication system within the market.
You've got it.
Yeah.
But markets are constantly changing. Tastes shift, new technologies pop up, and unexpected events happen. Understanding how markets react to these changes is key.
So it's not just about finding that equilibrium, but understanding how it moves and adjusts.
You're absolutely right. To understand these changes, we have to distinguish between movements along the curve versus shifts of the entire curve.
I'm intrigued. Explain those.
Okay, let's say the price of movie tickets drops. This brings in more people to the cinema, right? So this change in quantity demanded due to the price change is just us moving along the same demand curve.
So just sliding along the same path.
Right. But a shift of the whole curve happens when something other than the goods price changes. Like with oranges. Imagine a frost wipes out a bunch of oranges. This decreases the supply, shifting the entire supply curve. Now fewer oranges are available at every price.
So a shift means the entire path changes, not just where we are on it.
Precisely. So, what causes these shifts? Well, for demand, it could be changes in income, preferences, or even prices of related goods. Like if people suddenly earn more, they might buy more luxury cars, shifting the entire demand curve for those cars.
Income plays a big role. What about supply shifts?
Those can be caused by changes in technology, production costs, or even the number of sellers in the market. Let's say a breakthrough in solar panels makes them much cheaper to produce. This would shift the supply curve, meaning more solar panels are available at every price.
So it's a chain reaction. One change sets off a whole cascade of effects.
Exactly. Now, besides those internal market forces, there are also external factors that can influence supply and demand.
Like what?
Well, taxes and subsidies.
Ah, yes. Taxes, can't forget those.
Taxes are a big part of the picture. They can increase the cost for buyers or lower the revenue for sellers. Think about a tax on those sugary drinks. It makes them pricier, right? This could shift demand, potentially leading to people drinking less of them.
Interesting. So taxes can nudge people toward healthier choices. Didn't think about that.
They can. Now, subsidies are kind of the opposite. They're payments from the government to encourage things like investing in renewable energy. They can effectively lower production costs or boost buying power.
So this can shift supply or demand to encourage activity in specific areas.
You got it. Like if the government subsidizes electric vehicles, they become more affordable, increasing demand.
Wow, we've covered so much. Markets, supply and demand, even taxes and subsidies. It's amazing to see how these forces work in the real world.
That's great. But remember, these are the basics. Let's zoom in now on how individuals make everyday economic choices. Ready to unlock the secrets of consumer behavior.
Definitely. Let's see how it all translates into real-world decisions.
Perfect. Think about those times you have to choose between spending on something like, oh, I don't know, a pizza versus getting that concert ticket you've been wanting. That's what consumer choice theory is all about.
Uh-huh. I know that feeling all too well. Pizza versus books, movies versus, well, more pizza. It's a constant struggle. How do we make sense of those decisions?
Well, it starts with a simple concept, the budget constraint. We all have limited resources, right? Time, energy, money. So we have to make choices. Our source material has this great example. Imagine you have 50 euros to spend, and you can choose between books and snacks.
So I can't just buy an endless supply of both. There's a limit.
Sadly, yes. Your 50 euro, that's your budget constraint. You pick different combinations that fit in that budget.
So how do we pick the best combination?
That's where utility comes in. Utility is basically the satisfaction or happiness we get from a good or service. People want to maximize that happiness within their budget.
Makes sense. It's all about getting the biggest bang for your buck.
Right. Now, to visualize this, economists use these things called indifference curves. Imagine a graph. Each point represents a different mix of, say, books and snacks. And each point on a single indifference curve means you're equally satisfied.
So even though the combinations are different, I'm equally happy.
Exactly. Indifference curves, they can't cross each other. Each curve represents a different level of happiness. Higher curves, well, that's more satisfaction.
Okay, starting to see how this connects. So how do we find that perfect spot where our budget and preferences meet?
That's where we find the optimal choice. It's where the highest indifference curve touches your budget line.
So that's the combination that gives me the most happiness with the money I have.
You got it. We have two scenarios here. One is an interior solution where your budget line just touches the indifference curve. That's like a balanced choice.
Makes sense. And the other scenario?
That's the corner solution where you spend all your budget on just one good.
Like if I'm absolutely crazy about books, I might just blow my entire budget on them and skip the snacks altogether.
Exactly. Now, at this optimal choice, there's a special condition. It's when the marginal rate of substitution, or MRS.
MRS, that sounds familiar.
The MRS captures how much of one good you'd give up to get one more of the other, but still be equally happy.
So how much am I willing to trade one thing for another?
Right. Like if you're deciding between movies and dinners, your budget allows a few different combinations. You'll go for the mix on the highest indifference curve that still touches your budget line.
So it's balancing my willingness to trade off against what I can actually afford.
Precisely. Now, keep in mind, consumer preferences come in different forms. There are perfect substitutes, things you can swap at a constant rate. Think 2 brands of bottled water that you see as the same. Then there are perfect complements goods that go together, always in fixed amounts, like left and right shoes.
You can't have one without the other.
Right. And then there's that quasi-linear utility, where one good brings consistent satisfaction, but adding another boosts happiness. Recognizing these differences is important because it affects how people react to price changes.
It's fascinating how choosing between pizza and a concert is actually rooted in these economic principles.
It is. And all of this relies on assumptions about how consumers behave.
Right.
Like they have complete preferences, so they can rank all possible combinations. Then there's transitivity, meaning if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you also prefer A to C.
Okay, those sound pretty logical. What else?
Well, there's also non-satiation, basically. Consumers always want more.
Yeah.
And lastly, convexity, meaning people prefer a mix of goods rather than extremes.
So variety is the spice of life.
Exactly. These assumptions help us model how consumers make rational choices, even though, in reality, things are often messier.
Speaking of real life, let's shift to something that affects us all. Demand.
Great idea. Now that we've talked about individual choices, let's see how they shape overall demand in the market.
Ready for that big picture view?
All right, remember those curves we mentioned before, the price consumption curve and the income consumption curve?
Yeah. They show how price and income changes affect what people buy, right?
Exactly. They track those shifts in a consumer's choices as prices or income fluctuate. For example, the price consumption curve shows the different combinations of two goods a consumer chooses as the price of one of those goods changes.
Like a roadmap of how my spending habits change if my favorite coffee suddenly gets more expensive.
Right. And the income consumption curve maps out how much more or less of each good a consumer buys as their income changes. For example, as a student gets more income, maybe they buy more books and snacks. This curve shows exactly how those purchases change as their income rises.
So it's a visual representation of how our buying power changes with our income.
Exactly. These curves have real-world implications. Think about how companies use them to predict how we'll react to a sale or a price increase.
That makes sense. Speaking of reactions, how about elasticity? How sensitive is demand to price or income changes?
Great point. Elasticity measures that sensitivity. First, there's own price elasticity of demand. This measures the percentage change in quantity demanded because of a 1% change in price.
So if the price of my favorite coffee goes up by 1%, how much less will I buy?
Exactly. If that change in demand is bigger than the change in price, then demand is elastic, very responsive to price changes.
So if the price of a luxury car skyrockets, people might buy way fewer cars, making that demand elastic.
You got it. But if the change in demand is smaller than the price change, demand is inelastic. It's not as sensitive.
So even if gas prices go up, people might not drastically reduce their driving, making demand for gas inelastic.
Right. Then there's income elasticity of demand, how demand changes as income fluctuates.
So if I get a raise, how much more of something will I buy?
You got it. If income elasticity is positive, then we're talking about normal goods. As income goes up, demand goes up. Luxury goods have an income elasticity greater than 1, so demand rises faster than income. Necessities have an income elasticity between 0 and 1, so demand rises but slower than income.
So a raise might mean slightly fancier coffee, but probably not a sudden yacht purchase.
Precisely. Now, if income elasticity is negative, those are inferior goods. Demand falls as income rises. Think about those cheap instant noodles you might have survived on as a student. As your income grows, you're less likely to buy them.
Makes sense. What about the last type of elasticity, cross-price elasticity?
You're on a roll. This measures how the demand for one good changes when the price of another good changes. Positive cross-price elasticity means they're substitutes. As the price of one goes up, demand for the other increases. Negative cross-price elasticity, well, that means they're complements things usually use together.
So if the price of tea goes way up, people might switch to coffee. But if peanut butter gets pricier, people might buy less jelly.
Exactly. Understanding these elasticities is super important for businesses, policymakers, and even just for us as consumers trying to make sense of the market.
This is all so insightful. We've covered markets, demand, supply, equilibrium, even elasticity. Can we now dive into a topic that hits closer to home? Taxes, and how they affect our choices as consumers.
Absolutely. Taxes are a great example of how microeconomics works in the real world. Ready to unravel their impact on markets and our decisions.
Bring on the tax talk.
All right, so let's get into the impact of taxes. You see, when a tax is added to a good or service, it either increases the price buyers pay or lowers the revenue sellers get.
It's like this wedge between buyers and sellers.
Yeah, precisely. This price shift has two main effects, substitution and income effects.
Those sound familiar. Can you remind me how those work?
Sure. The substitution effect kicks in when the price of the taxed good goes up, and people naturally start looking for cheaper alternatives. Take, for example, a tax on sugary drinks. Consumers might start choosing water, unsweetened tea, maybe even pull out that old juicer.
Ah, so taxes can nudge people toward healthier choices?
Hmm.
That's an interesting side effect.
Indeed. The income effect acknowledges that the tax-induced price hike basically reduces people's buying power. They have less to spend overall.
It's not just about finding a cheaper option. It's also about having less money to spend.
Exactly. And to figure out just how much a tax affects consumer well-being, economists use a couple of concepts: compensating variation and equivalent variation.
Those sound a bit technical. Can you explain those?
Think of compensating variation, CV, as the money you'd need to give back to consumers to offset the price increase from the tax, so they'd be back at their original level of utility.
Like making them whole again after the tax hits their wallet.
Exactly. Equivalent variation, EV, on the other hand, is the amount consumers would willingly pay before the tax to avoid that price increase altogether.
So it's like preemptively dodging the tax bullet.
Precisely. Both CV and EV help us understand how much a tax impacts people, even if they don't consciously realize it.
Makes sense. Okay, so taxes affect prices, buying power, well-being. But how do they impact consumer surplus?
Consumer surplus is an important concept here. It's the difference between what consumers are willing to pay for something and what they actually pay. It's like a measure of the extra value they're getting. Before the tax, consumer surplus is all that area under the demand curve and above the price line.
So if, say, concert tickets are suddenly taxed, consumer surplus shrinks because people either pay more or buy fewer tickets.
Exactly. Taxes take a bite out of consumer surplus, transferring some of that value to government revenue and potentially causing what we call deadweight loss.
Deadweight loss. Doesn't sound good.
It's not ideal. Deadweight loss is the reduction in overall economic well-being that happens when the market isn't at its most efficient point. It's like lost potential.
So taxes can actually make the market less efficient.
They can, especially if they're poorly designed. Now let's picture how this works graphically. When a tax is put on sellers, the supply curve shifts upward by the amount of the tax. This makes a new equilibrium where consumers pay a higher price and sellers get less after paying the tax. The difference between these prices is the tax burden.
So the tax creates this gap between what buyers pay and what sellers get.
Exactly. Now, who really bears the brunt of this tax? The incidence of the tax depends on the elasticities of both demand and supply.
Ah, elasticity again. So if demand is very elastic, meaning people are really sensitive to price changes, sellers might have to absorb more of the tax to keep selling.
Exactly. But if demand is inelastic, like with gas, even if the tax goes up, people still need to drive, so consumers might bear more of the tax.
It's like a tug of war between buyers and sellers, and elasticity determines who wins.
That's a great analogy.
Taxes are way more complex than I thought. It's not just about the government getting money. It's this whole web of interactions between buyers, sellers, prices, and those elasticities.
You got it. Taxes are a fantastic real-world example of how those microeconomic principles we've been discussing work in practice. They affect everyone: individuals, businesses, and even the whole economy.
This has been a crash course in taxes.
Hmm.
Now let's shift gears a bit. How about we explore how people decide between spending now and saving for later? That whole present versus future dilemma always gets me.
Absolutely. Let's delve into intertemporal choices, how people navigate those dilemmas. It's all about balancing present desires against future goals.
Sounds intriguing. Let's unlock those intertemporal mysteries.
All right. Have you ever debated whether to indulge in something now or save up for a future goal? That tempting new gadget versus saving for, say, a down payment on a house. That's intertemporal choice in a nutshell.
It's that constant struggle between instant gratification and planning for the future.
Precisely. Economics helps us understand how people make those choices.
Okay, where do we begin?
The foundation is the intertemporal budget constraint. Consumers have to decide how to split their income between consumption now, C1, and consumption later, C2.
It's like balancing spending today versus saving for tomorrow.
Exactly. The intertemporal budget constraint captures that trade-off mathematically. The equation basically says the total value of present and future consumption can't be more than your total income, considering interest earned on savings.
No need to get into the equation right now. Can you give a more relatable example?
Sure. Let's say a student has €1,000 right now and expects to get another 1,100 next year. Let's also say the interest rate on savings is 10%. This information forms their intertemporal budget constraint. It outlines all the possible combinations of spending now and saving for next year.
So they could spend it all now and have nothing extra next year, or save it all for a bigger sum next year thanks to the interest, or find some balance in between.
Exactly. The constraint shows the boundaries of their choices based on their income and the interest rate.
Got it. But how do individual preferences fit into this? Some people are just more patient, right?
You're right. That's where the marginal rate of time preference, MRTP, comes in. This captures a person's willingness to trade off present consumption for future consumption.
So a high MRTP means you're really impatient and want to spend everything now.
Well, not exactly. It means they place a higher value on present consumption compared to future consumption. They're willing to give up more later to enjoy something extra today.
So a patient person with a low MRTP is more likely to save, while someone with a high MRTP might prioritize spending now.
Precisely. MRTP helps us understand how individuals make that trade-off. What's interesting is that at the optimal consumption point, the MRTP will be equal to 1 plus the interest rate.
Interesting. So the interest rate also influences these decisions.
Absolutely. A higher interest rate can make saving more attractive, leading to a bigger return on your savings.
So our preferences for present versus future consumption, plus the interest rate, shape our choices. This paints a clearer picture.
It does. Now, let's discuss how changes in income and interest rates can shake things up a bit.
I'm ready for more real-world scenarios.
All right. Imagine an increase in current income. This would typically lead to higher consumption both now and in the future. It's like getting a raise. Maybe you treat yourself now and also save more for later.
Sounds about right. What about if future income increases?
Well, that would usually lead to a bigger jump in future consumption compared to present consumption. It's like knowing you have a bonus coming next year. Maybe you tighten your belt now to enjoy that extra cash later.
Got it. Now, what about changes in the interest rate? Does that throw a wrench in things?
It definitely can. For borrowers, a higher interest rate makes borrowing more expensive, so present consumption becomes more costly. They might cut back on spending now.
So if loan interest rates shoot up, people might think twice about that new car or a mortgage.
Exactly. But for lenders, higher interest means a better return on their savings rate. This can make saving more attractive and maybe even lead to a small increase in spending now.
So if my savings account is earning more interest, I might feel a little more comfortable spending on a vacation right now.
Precisely. Changes in income and interest rates have a ripple effect on our spending and saving habits, depending on each person's situation and preferences.
This clarifies so much about how we make financial decisions. We've learned how individuals choose between spending and saving, considering their budget, their time preferences, and the interest rate.
That's right. We've also seen how those income and interest rate changes can impact those choices, showing just how dynamic these decisions can be.
But real life is full of uncertainties. How do people make decisions when they're not sure what will happen? That always makes me hesitate.
That's a great point. Uncertainty is a big part of life, and economics has some fantastic tools to help us understand how individuals decide when facing risk and the unknown.
Okay, I'm ready to face the unknown, or at least try to understand it a little better.
Great. One of the basic models is the von Neumann-Morgenstern expected utility model.
Expected utility. So are we trying to predict the future now?
Not quite. It's more about understanding how people value different outcomes and then calculating a weighted average based on how likely each outcome is.
So we're weighing the potential gains and losses against the odds of each happening.
Precisely. People's attitudes toward risk are important here. There are 3 main types: risk-averse, risk-neutral, and risk-loving.
Those sound pretty self-explanatory. Risk-averse people just don't like taking chances, right?
Exactly. They prefer a guaranteed outcome, even if a gamble offers the same expected value. Their utility function is concave, meaning the more they have, the less each additional unit adds to their satisfaction.
So a risk-averse person would rather have a guaranteed €50 VIV or two than a 50-50 chance of winning 100 or nothing, even though the gamble also has an expected value of €50.
Precisely. Now, risk-neutral individuals are indifferent between a sure thing and a gamble with the same expected value. For them, those options are basically the same.
So they're like the calm and collected folks in economics.
You could say that. Their utility function is linear. Each additional unit brings the same satisfaction no matter how much they already have.
Interesting. And then we have the risk lovers. They thrive on uncertainty.
Exactly. They actually prefer the thrill of a gamble over a sure thing, even if the gamble might give them less. They love the chance of winning big, even if it means taking on more risk. Their utility function is convex. The more they have, the more each extra unit adds to their satisfaction.
So these are the lottery players and the high-risk investors.
You got it. Understanding these different risk attitudes is key to predicting how people behave in uncertain situations. Think about insurance companies, for example. Their whole business model is based on people's aversion to risk.
Makes sense. What about certainty equivalent and risk premium? How do those concepts fit in?
The certainty equivalent is the guaranteed amount that would make someone indifferent between taking a gamble and getting that guaranteed amount for sure.
So it's like the price tag on peace of mind, how much someone would pay to avoid the uncertainty.
Exactly. And the risk premium is the difference between the expected value of the gamble and that certainty equivalent. It measures how much they're willing to pay to eliminate the risk.
So if a gamble has an expected value of €100, but a risk-averse person would only take a guaranteed €80 instead, that risk premium is 20.
Precisely. The higher the risk premium, the more risk-averse someone is.
So it's a way to measure how much they dislike risk.
Exactly. This has major implications for things like insurance premiums, investment decisions, even salary negotiations.
Wow, think about risk in a whole new way now. What about situations where people have different levels of information? How does that impact decisions in markets?
Great question. The world is full of information asymmetries, where one party has more information than another.
Like when you're buying a used car. The seller probably knows way more about the car's history than the buyer.
Exactly. That's a classic example. The seller might downplay any problems or exaggerate the car's value, putting the buyer at a disadvantage.
So how do buyers protect themselves?
That's where things like vehicle history reports, inspections, and warranties come in. They level the playing field by giving the buyer more information.
So what are some other areas where information asymmetry can impact the economy?
Think about insurance markets. People who know they're high risk might be more likely to buy insurance, while low-risk people might not bother. This can lead to adverse selection. The insurance pool ends up with more high-risk individuals, which drives up costs for everyone.
So that's why insurance companies ask so many questions to assess your risk level.
Exactly. They're trying to get as much information as possible to price their policies accurately and minimize that adverse selection problem.
Information asymmetry is making more sense now. But why would someone reveal negative information about themselves? That seems counterintuitive.
That's a great point, and it brings us to signaling.
Signaling, like sending of smoke signals.
Not quite, but the idea is similar. In economics, signaling refers to actions people or companies take to convey information about themselves.
Okay, I need an example here.
Imagine getting a degree from a prestigious university. That's often seen as a signal of intelligence, work ethic, and potential. It helps people stand out in the job market.
So it's like saying, hey, I'm a good investment.
Exactly. But for a signal to work, it has to be credible. It needs to be costly enough that others can't easily fake it.
So it's like a guarantee backed by a big investment.
Right. That cost is what makes it believable.
Okay, I get it. Education is a signal. What are some other examples?
Think about advertising. Companies spend huge sums to signal the quality of their products. Or a company offering a really good warranty, that's a strong signal of quality and durability.
Like saying, we believe in our products.
Exactly. Now here's a twist. Sometimes, revealing even negative information can be strategic, as explained by the full disclosure principle.
Wait, why would anyone willingly share something bad about themselves?
Imagine you're applying for a job and have a gap in your work history. Instead of trying to hide it, you proactively explain the reason. Maybe you were caring for a family member, traveling, or working on a personal project. Being upfront lets you frame the situation positively.
So it's about addressing a potential concern before it even comes up.
Exactly. Full disclosure can build trust, especially if withholding information could backfire later.
This whole world of information and signaling is fascinating. It really highlights how much communication goes on beyond just words, especially in economics.
Absolutely. And another challenge in decision-making is uncertainty. How do we decide when we don't know what the outcome will be?
It feels like the future is always a mystery.
That's true. But economics has developed ways to model how people make choices when they're facing risk and the unknown.
Okay, let's dive into the world of uncertainty.
Great. We can use the von Neumann-Morgenstern expected utility model.
Expected utility. So are we trying to predict the future again?
No, not exactly. It's more about giving values to different outcomes and then calculating a weighted average based on the probability of those outcomes actually happening.
So weighing potential rewards against the risks and the likelihood of each.
Exactly. Again, people's attitude towards risk comes in here. Risk-averse, risk-neutral, and risk-loving.
We talked about those before. Risk-averse folks want certainty. Risk-neutral are indifferent, and risk-loving embrace the risk.
Exactly. Understanding these different approaches is key to predicting behavior in uncertain situations.
So how do certainty equivalent and risk premium fit into this?
The certainty equivalent is the guaranteed amount of money someone would take instead of a gamble, even if the gamble could offer the same expected value.
So it's the price they put on avoiding uncertainty.
Exactly. The risk premium is the difference between the gamble's expected value and that certainty equivalent. It's basically how much they'd pay to eliminate the risk.
So if a gamble could lead to €100, but a risk-averse person would only take a sure 80 instead, that risk premium is 20.
Precisely. The larger the risk premium, the more someone avoids risk.
So we're quantifying their dislike of risk.
Exactly. This has implications for things like insurance costs, investments, even salary negotiations.
I'm seeing risk in a whole new light. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about production. Time to see how things are made.
You got it. In microeconomics, production means using inputs like labor, capital, raw materials to create the goods and services we use. To understand this, we need to grasp the production function.
Okay, sounds like econ jargon is coming. What exactly is a production function?
Think of it like a recipe. It tells us how much output we can get from a specific mix of inputs. It's the relationship between inputs and outputs.
So a blueprint for making stuff.
Exactly. It generally looks like this. Q is FKL.
All right, let's break that down. What do those letters stand for?
Q is the quantity of output, K is the amount of capital used, and L is the amount of labor.
So if we're making pizzas, Q is the number of pizzas, K is the ovens, and L is the number of pizza chefs.
Exactly. The production function tells us how those ingredients, capital and labor, come together to create those pizzas.
Okay, now I'm getting hungry. But before we order a pizza, let's talk about the difference between the short run and the long run in production. Why is that important?
Is fixed, meaning it can't be easily changed. Think about a factory. They might be able to hire more workers in the short run, but they can't instantly expand the factory itself.
So they're limited by their current setup.
Exactly. That limits how much they can increase production in the short run. But in the long run, all inputs are variable. They have more flexibility.
So they could expand the factory, get new equipment, even change the whole process.
Exactly. The long run allows for those bigger strategic decisions.
Okay, I'm starting to get the difference. Now, what about this law of diminishing marginal returns?
This law states that as we add more of one input while keeping other inputs the same, the additional output we get from each extra unit of that input will eventually decrease.
So if we keep adding pizza chefs to our kitchen without getting more ovens, those extra chefs won't be making as many pizzas as the first few did.
Exactly. It gets crowded, they bump into each other, the ovens become a bottleneck, diminishing marginal returns in action.
Too many cooks in the kitchen. How do we measure these diminishing returns?
We use the marginal product of labor, MPL. This measures the additional output from adding one more unit of labor. In our pizza example, it would tell us how many more pizzas we get by adding one more chef.
Got it. And the law tells us that MPL will go down as we add more chefs without changing anything else.
Exactly. Now let's talk about returns to scale.
Okay, returns to scale. What's that about?
This describes how output changes when we increase all inputs proportionally. Say we double the number of chefs and ovens. What happens to the number of pizzas?
Well, hopefully it more than doubles.
That's the idea behind increasing returns to scale, IRS. Output increases more than the proportional increase in inputs.
So making pizzas is getting more efficient as we scale up.
Exactly. It could be from things like specialization or better tech. Then there's economies of scale where costs go down as you produce more.
Okay, that makes sense. What about constant returns to scale?
With constant returns to scale, CRS, output increases proportionally to the increase in inputs. Double the inputs, double the output, a steady relationship.
Got it. So what about decreasing returns to scale?
Decreasing returns to scale, DRS, mean output increases by less than the increase in inputs. So double the inputs, you get less than double the output.
So the pizza operation is actually getting less efficient as it grows. Why would that happen?
It could be things like communication breakdowns, coordination issues, or running into resource limits as things get bigger.
So these returns to scale concepts are all about how output changes in relation to input changes.
Precisely. This is crucial for businesses making strategic decisions about how to best use their resources.
This breakdown of production has been great, but I'm curious about the costs involved in making all those pizzas. Let's talk about production costs.
Let's do it. Understanding costs is key for businesses to price things right, decide how much to produce, and stay profitable.
So it's not just about making stuff, it's about managing those costs too.
Absolutely. Let's start with costs in the short run. Remember, at least one input is fixed in the short run.
Right. Some costs are fixed no matter how much we produce, and others change based on output.
Exactly. Fixed costs, FC, are the same regardless of production level. Think rent for our pizza kitchen, insurance, salaries of core staff, one pizza or 100, those costs are constant.
Those are the basic expenses to keep things running.
Right. Variable costs, VC, on the other hand, change as output changes. Think ingredients or wages for extra chefs when things get busy.
Variable costs go up and down with production level.
Exactly. To get the total cost, PC, we add fixed and variable costs. TC equals FC plus VC.
Easy enough.
Now let's move on to marginal cost, MC, and average cost, AC.
Bring on the calculations.
Marginal cost is the extra cost for making one more unit of output. So if we make one more pizza, how much does our total cost go up? That's the MC.
Got it. How do we calculate that?
It's the change in total cost divided by the change in output, basically the cost of the last unit produced.
So if making 10 pizzas costs €100 and 11 pizzas cost €115, the marginal cost of that 11th pizza is 15.
Exactly. Average cost, AC, is the total cost per unit of output. Divide the total cost by the quantity produced.
So for 10 pizzas costing €100 to make, the average cost is €10 per pizza.
You got it. Understanding these costs is vital for businesses making decisions about production and pricing.
Okay, so we've tackled short-run costs. What about long-run costs? Are those calculated differently?
Good question. In the long run, remember, firms are more flexible. They can adjust everything, even inputs that were fixed in the short run.
Right. They can make those bigger, more strategic changes. How does that affect their costs?
That flexibility means long-run costs can be different from short-run costs. One important concept is long-run average cost, LAC. This is the lowest average cost a firm can achieve for each output level when all inputs are variable.
So it's about finding the most cost-efficient way to produce in the long run.
Precisely. And the shape of this LAC curve tells us a lot about a firm's economies of scale.
Right. Economies of scale. How does that relate to the LAC curve?
Well, if the LAC curve is sloping downward, that means they're experiencing economies of scale. As they produce more, their average cost per unit goes down.
So they're getting more efficient as they grow.
You got it. This can happen because of specialization, buying in bulk, or spreading those fixed costs over more output.
Okay, that makes sense. What about diseconomies of scale?
If the LAC curve slopes upward, that's diseconomies of scale. As they produce more, their average cost per unit actually increases.
So growing makes them less efficient. Why would that happen?
It could be things like communication issues, coordination problems, or resource limits as the firm gets bigger. Imagine a tech startup growing super fast. As they hire more people, communication can get messy, leading to duplicated work and slower decisions.
So economies and diseconomies of scale really come down to the relationship between production volume and the average cost per unit.
Exactly. Understanding this relationship helps businesses figure out the optimal scale for their operation. Now, to visualize these cost relationships, we use ISA cost lines.
ISA cost lines. Sounds like things are about to get visual.
They are, but they're not too complicated. ISA cost lines show all the different input combinations that cost the same amount. Think of them like budget lines for production.
So if I have a set budget for pizza ingredients, the ISA cost line shows all the different combos of dough, sauce, cheese I could buy.
Exactly. And the slope of that line depends on the relative prices of those inputs. Now, to figure out the best combination, we need to bring back those isoquants we talked about earlier.
Ah, those curved lines representing different input combos that produce the same output.
You got it. The best input combination is where the isocost line touches the highest possible isoquant. It's about minimizing cost while maximizing output.
We're getting the most bang for our buck.
Precisely. It's about striking that perfect balance between inputs and outputs to get the most efficiency and profit.
This has been a really insightful look at production costs. We've covered so much: fixed costs, variable costs, marginal costs, average cost, economies of scale, and how to see it all using isocost lines and isoquants.
I feel like I'm becoming a production expert.
You're well on your way. Now, let's shift gears and explore market structures, starting with the most extreme: monopoly.
Monopoly, like the board game where you control everything.
Monopolies in economics aren't quite as fun. They can have drawbacks for consumers, but it's important to understand how they work.
Okay, I'm ready to explore the world of monopolies. First up, how do we define a monopoly?
A monopoly exists when a single company is the only supplier of a product or service with no close substitutes. They have a lot of power and can influence prices.
So they're the only game in town, no competition. Exactly. Now, monopolies have a few key characteristics. First, as we said, there's a single seller. Second, no close substitutes. Customers can't easily switch to a different product if they don't like what the monopolist offers.
So if they hike prices or lower quality, customers are stuck.
Pretty much. Third, there are high barriers to entry. It's tough for other firms to enter the market and compete.
What kind of barriers are we talking about?
These barriers could be patents, control over resources, government regulations, or high startup costs that discourage competitors. Think about a utility company providing electricity. There's often little competition because the infrastructure is so expensive and complex to set up.
Okay, so monopolies can really hold on to their power. How do they figure out how much to produce and at what price?
Like any business, a monopolist wants to maximize profits. They want to find the point where their revenue is much higher than their costs.
Profit is the goal, right. But monopolists have more control over prices than businesses in a competitive market.
Exactly. They face a downward sloping demand curve, meaning they have to lower prices to sell more.
So it's a balancing act. Sell a lot at a low price or sell less at a higher price.
Precisely. To maximize profits, they need to look at their marginal revenue, MR, the extra revenue from selling just one more unit. Right, so marginal revenue is about how much extra money they bring in when they sell one more unit.
Got it.
And here's the difference between monopolies and competitive markets. For a monopolist, the marginal revenue is always less than the price they charge.
Wait, really? Why is that? I thought if you sell one more unit, your revenue goes up by the price of that unit.
That's true in a competitive market, but remember, a monopolist has that downward sloping demand curve. To sell more, they have to lower the price, not just for the extra unit, but for all the units they're selling.
Ah, I see. So they're losing a bit of revenue on those other units because of the lower price.
Exactly. To get the most profit, a monopolist produces where their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. MC.
Right, marginal cost, the cost of making that one extra unit. So they keep producing until the extra revenue from selling one more balances out the extra cost of making it.
You got it. And unlike those competitive companies, monopolists can set their price above the marginal cost. They use what's called markup pricing, charging a higher price to boost profits.
So they have some wiggle room with pricing.
They do, and they don't have to worry about competitors undercutting them, which gives them even more power over pricing.
Interesting. What else is different about monopolies?
Well, they don't have a supply curve in the traditional sense.
Wait, what? No supply curve? I thought those were like Economics 101.
They are important, but in a competitive market, the supply curve shows how much firms want to produce at different prices. Monopolists don't make production decisions based just on the market price. They look at the entire demand curve and their cost structure to figure out the most profitable quantity and price.
So it's a different game for them.
You could say that. Now let's talk about something called price discrimination, a really interesting thing monopolies can do.
Price discrimination, that sounds a bit, well, discriminatory.
It can be. It basically means charging different prices to different customers for the same product, or even different prices based on how much they buy.
So some customers get special treatment.
In a way, yes. Monopolists do this to get more of that consumer surplus, that extra value customers are willing to pay, and boost their profits.
How do they get away with this?
There are three main types of price discrimination. First-degree price discrimination is the most extreme. The monopolist charges each customer the absolute maximum they're willing to pay.
It's like personalized pricing.
Yeah.
Based on how desperate each customer is.
You could think of it that way, but it's really rare because it's so hard to figure out what each person is willing to pay.
Okay, what about the second type?
That's second-degree price discrimination, where the price depends on the quantity purchased. Think about bulk discounts. You get a lower price per unit if you buy a lot.
So those buy one, get one free deals are a sneaky way of doing price discrimination.
Exactly. It gets people to buy more, which can lead to more profits.
Makes sense. What's the third type?
That's third-degree price discrimination, probably the most common. This involves splitting customers into groups and charging different prices to each group.
So like dividing the market and adjusting prices based on each group's willingness to pay.
Exactly. Think about movie theaters with discounts for students and seniors. They're more sensitive to prices, so the theater attracts them with lower prices. Or airlines with different fare classes, they appeal to both budget travelers and those who want more luxury.
Okay, that makes sense. So price discrimination helps monopolies maximize profit by targeting different groups.
Yes. But while it might be good for their profits, price discrimination can have downsides for consumers and the economy.
So there are trade-offs here.
Always. One issue is something called allocative inefficiency. Monopolies, even with price discrimination, tend to produce less and charge more than companies in a competitive market.
So consumers get less stuff, and it costs them more.
Right. And that leads to deadweight loss, a reduction in overall economic well-being.
Right, we talked about deadweight loss before. It's like the potential benefits that are lost because the market isn't operating at its best.
Exactly. This highlights why governments often try to regulate monopolies or promote competition.
Okay, monopolies are starting to sound a bit less appealing. What about the opposite end of the spectrum? Perfect competition.
Sounds good. Perfect competition is kind of like the ideal scenario. It's a benchmark against which we can compare other market structures.
So perfect competition is like economic utopia, where everything works perfectly.
Well, it's more of a theoretical model.
Huh.
But it does show us some key principles of how efficient markets work.
Okay, let's explore this perfect world. What makes perfect competition so special?
Perfect competition has a few defining features. First, tons of firms are competing, so many that no single firm can impact the price. Second, every firm makes identical products. There's no difference between them, no branding to make one stand out.
So it's just a sea of interchangeable products.
Exactly. With all those firms selling the same thing, each is a price taker. They have to go with the market price, which is set by supply and demand.
So they have absolutely no control over the price.
None. They have to play by the market's rules. Third, entry and exit are free. Firms can easily join or leave the market, no big obstacles.
So there's no big guy controlling who gets in or out.
Exactly. This keeps things competitive and ensures no single company can take over.
Okay, starting to see why perfect competition is considered ideal. Lots of businesses, same products, everyone's a price taker, easy to join or leave. It's a level playing field. What else makes it special?
The last key characteristic is perfect information. Everyone, buyers and sellers, knows everything about prices, quality, all the relevant information in the market.
No secrets, no surprises, no information asymmetry. Everyone's in the loop.
Exactly. This transparency helps markets run smoothly and efficiently.
Perfect competition really does sound utopian. But how do firms in this world decide how much to produce and what to charge if they can't set prices?
Great question. Since they're price takers, they follow a simple rule to maximize profit. Produce the quantity where their marginal cost, MC, equals the market price.
Right, MC is the cost of making one more unit. So they keep producing until that extra cost matches the market price.
Precisely. They don't want to make more because they'd lose money, and they don't want to make less because they'd be missing out on potential profit. It's about finding that sweet spot.
That makes sense. What happens if they can't even cover their costs at the market price? Do they just keep losing money?
That's where the short-run shutdown condition comes in. If the market price falls below the firm's average variable cost, AVC, they're better off temporarily stopping production.
AVC, right? That's the variable cost per unit, the costs that change directly with production, like materials and labor.
You got it. If the price is below the AVC, the company is losing money on each unit. So it's better to stop for a while and minimize losses. They can always start up again when prices go back up.
So a way to weather those tough times.
Exactly. A firm's short-run supply curve is the portion of their marginal cost curve that's above the AVC curve.
So if the price is above their AVC, they'll produce. If it falls below, they shut down.
Exactly. Now, let's zoom out and talk about market equilibrium in the short run under perfect competition.
Right, equilibrium where supply and demand meet, setting the market price and quantity traded.
Exactly. In a perfectly competitive market, the short-run equilibrium happens when the total quantity supplied by all those companies matches the total quantity demanded by consumers at the market price.
So it's a snapshot of the market where everything balances out.
You got it. Now let's look at the long run. Remember, firms can enter or exit freely in the long run.
Right, no barriers. How does that change things?
If firms are making a profit, it attracts new firms to the market. More competition increases supply, which pushes prices down.
Those profits act like a magnet.
Exactly. And as more firms enter, the price drops until firms are no longer making economic profits.
Economic profit, that's different from regular profit, right?
It is. Economic profit considers explicit costs like wages, rent, materials, and implicit costs, which are like the opportunity cost of using resources one way versus another.
Implicit costs are like The hidden costs, the value of the next best option that's being given up.
Precisely. Zero economic profit means firms are making just enough to cover all their costs, both explicit and implicit. They're making a normal profit, but no economic profit.
So they're breaking even, all things considered.
Exactly. And that's what usually happens in the long-run equilibrium of a perfectly competitive market.
Okay, so new firms enter if there are profits, driving prices down until everyone breaks even. It's like a self-correction towards efficiency.
Exactly. Now, this long-run equilibrium has some important implications. First, we get productive efficiency. Firms are producing at the lowest possible average total cost, squeezing the most out of their inputs.
So they're operating as efficiently as possible.
Precisely. We also get allocative efficiency. This means that resources are going towards the production of what consumers value the most. The market price equals the marginal cost, so the benefit to consumers from one more unit perfectly balances with the cost of producing it.
So everyone wins. Firms are super efficient, and we get the goods and services we want most.
Exactly. Let's compare perfect competition and monopoly side by side.
Sounds like a good idea. What are the big differences?
The biggest contrast is competition. Lots of firms competing in perfect competition, while one firm controls the whole market in a monopoly.
It's that bustling market versus the solitary fortress like we talked about earlier.
Exactly. This difference really impacts prices and output.
Right. Monopolists charge higher prices because there's no competition. What about the amount they produce?
Monopolists typically produce less output than we'd see in perfect competition. They're focused on maximizing profits, and sometimes that means keeping output low to keep those prices high.
So consumers get less, and they have to pay more. Sounds rough for the consumer.
You're right. And that difference in output is a big part of that deadweight loss we discussed. It's inefficient, not producing as much as they could be, and charging higher prices.
Right. Deadweight loss, all those missed opportunities.
Exactly. It's one of the main critiques of monopolies.
So competition is ultimately better for consumers, prices, output, and the whole economy.
Precisely. Competition pushes firms to innovate, lower prices, and give consumers what they want.
This comparison really highlights the differences. Any real-world examples that illustrate this?
Think about the market for wheat. With many farmers producing the same kind of wheat, it's very close to perfect competition. Prices are low, output is high, and resources are used efficiently.
So it's like that picture of the abundant wheat fields.
Exactly. Now compare that to a market controlled by a monopoly, like a utility company. With no competition, they can raise prices and produce less, leading to big profits for them, but higher costs and fewer choices for us.
So the wheat market is a bustling market with tons of choices and low prices, while the utility company is that solitary fortress with limited choices and high prices.
That's a great analogy. This is why economists and policymakers often try to encourage competition and prevent monopolies from forming.
This has been such a fascinating look at market structures. We've seen how competition, or the lack of it, can really impact everything. Now let's move on to a different kind of competition. One where businesses have to think about each other's moves and strategize. I'm ready to dive into game theory.
Excellent. Game theory gives us a framework to analyze those strategic interactions between decision makers. It helps us understand behavior when the outcome depends not only on your own actions, but also on what others do.
Okay, I'm ready for some economic games.
Great. There are a few key concepts in game theory. First, we have the players, the decision makers. They could be individuals, companies, governments, anyone making strategic choices.
So they're the ones making the moves.
Exactly. Next are the strategies, the different actions each player can choose from.
So it's like a game plan, the different options they have.
Precisely. Then we have payoffs, the outcomes for each player, based on the combination of strategies everyone chooses.
It's like a scorecard. It tells us who wins and loses or how much each player gains or loses.
You've got it. A key assumption is that the players are rational. They want to maximize their payoffs and are making strategic choices to get the best possible result.
Like a game of chess, where everyone is trying to outsmart each other.
Perfect analogy. There are different types of games. In static games, players make their choices simultaneously without knowing what the others will choose.
So they're making their move at the same time, completely blind to what everyone else is doing.
That's right. A classic example is rock, paper, scissors.
Yes. What about dynamic games?
In those games, players take turns, and earlier choices influence later decisions. Think of a chess match, where each move opens and closes off different possibilities.
So it's a more complex back and forth.
Exactly. We can also have games of complete information, where everyone knows the rules, the payoffs, and everyone's possible strategies, versus games of incomplete information, where some of that is hidden.
So complete information is like playing poker with all the cards face up, while incomplete information is like playing poker in the real world, where you have to guess what other players have.
You got it. Incomplete information adds a whole other layer of strategy.
Okay, so we've got static versus dynamic games, complete versus incomplete information. How do we analyze these and figure out how players will behave?
One powerful tool is Nash equilibrium.
Nash equilibrium. That sounds familiar. We touched on that with oligopolies,
We
right?
did. A Nash equilibrium happens when no player can improve their outcome by changing their strategy alone, given what everyone else is doing. Everyone is basically making the best move they can.
So it's like a stalemate. Nobody has a reason to change unless someone else does first.
Exactly. To illustrate, let's look at a famous game theory example. The prisoner's dilemma.
The prisoner's dilemma. I've heard of this. It's a classic.
It really is. It shows how doing what's best for you individually can sometimes lead to a worse outcome for everyone. Imagine two suspects, Alice and Bob, arrested for a crime. They're in separate cells, can't communicate.
Okay, so they're totally isolated, no chance to coordinate their story.
Exactly. The police offer each a deal, confess and implicate the other person, and the confessor goes free while the other gets a long sentence. If both confess, each gets a moderate sentence. If both stay silent, they each get a short sentence.
It's a classic case of snitching versus staying loyal.
You could say that. Now, the best outcome for both is to cooperate and stay silent. They both get a lighter sentence.
Right, because if they both betray each other, they both end up with more time.
Exactly. But here's the catch. From each suspect's perspective, confessing is always the best strategy, regardless of what the other does.
So even though cooperating is best overall, their own self-interest makes them betray each other.
Exactly. That's the dilemma. Even though cooperation would be better, the rational choice for each, acting in their own best interest, is to confess.
That's crazy. So what's the Nash equilibrium in this case?
The Nash equilibrium is for both suspects to confess. Neither one can do better by switching strategies, assuming the other stays put.
So they're stuck in a suboptimal outcome.
Exactly. The prisoner's dilemma shows how those strategic interactions don't always lead to the best overall result, even when cooperation seems like the obvious solution.
It really makes you think. Cooperation can be risky, but ultimately lead to better results.
You've got it. Game theory helps us understand many other interactions too, like the stag hunt, the battle of the sexes, even the decisions of companies and oligopolies, like we talked about before with the Cournot and Bertrand models.
So game theory is a really versatile tool to understand how people act strategically in all sorts of situations.
Exactly. It's relevant to individuals, businesses, politics, even international relations.
This has been a mind-blowing dive into game theory. We've explored different types of games, Nash equilibrium, and that classic prisoner's dilemma. Now, can we take an even broader view and talk about how all the different markets in an economy fit together? I'm ready to see the big picture.
Absolutely. Get ready for general equilibrium.
I can't wait to see how it all connects.
Great. So far, we've mostly focused on one market at a time, but in reality, markets are all linked. A change in one can ripple through the whole economy.
So it's like a giant web of interconnected systems.
Exactly. General equilibrium analysis looks at this interconnectedness, how markets interact, and how they all reach a state of balance simultaneously.
I'm starting to see how complex this can get. Can you give an example to illustrate these connections?
Imagine a big increase in demand for electric vehicles. That won't just affect car sales, it'll also impact the market for batteries, the raw materials needed for those batteries, the electricity market as people charge their cars, even the job market as companies try to hire workers to meet demand.
Wow. It's a chain reaction across the economy.
Exactly. General equilibrium helps us make sense of those ripple effects and how the economy adjusts as a whole.
Okay, how do economists visualize and study these interactions?
One helpful tool is the Edgeworth box.
The Edgeworth box, what's that?
It's a graphical way to visualize how resources are distributed between two consumers and how they might trade to reach an outcome that's good for both of them.
So it's showing how people can benefit from trading with each other.
Exactly. The Edgeworth box helps us understand Pareto efficiency, which is when no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off.
So it's finding the best possible outcome for everyone, given the resources we have.
Precisely. The Edgeworth box lets us see those efficient allocations of resources.
This is starting to make sense. What conditions are needed to reach Pareto efficiency?
One important condition is that the marginal rate of substitution, MRS, remember, that's how much of one good someone will trade for another while staying equally happy, must be the same for everyone and must also equal the ratio of prices for those goods.
So everyone values things in the same way, and those values are reflected in the market prices.
Precisely. Another key concept in general equilibrium is market clearing. This means that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded in every single market in the economy.
So everything is perfectly balanced.
You got it. No shortages, no surpluses. A helpful principle to understand this is Walras's law, which says that if all markets except one are in equilibrium, that last one must also be in equilibrium.
Like dominoes, if all but one have fallen, that last one has to fall too.
Precisely. It highlights how interconnected markets are and how they work together to reach an overall equilibrium.
Okay, so Pareto efficiency, market clearing, and Walras law, they all contribute to this balanced system. What about production? How do we ensure that production is efficient too in general equilibrium?
Efficiency in production means you can't rearrange the inputs, labor, capital, and so on to produce more of one good without reducing the output of another. It's like pushing production to its absolute limit with the current technology.
So we're getting the most we can out of the resources we have, given our current technology.
Exactly. Remember the production possibility frontier, PPF. It shows us those maximum combinations of goods an economy can produce. And the PPF's shape shows the trade-offs, how much of one good we have to give up to make more of another.
Right, the PPF illustrates those tough choices.
Exactly. Now, for efficient production in general equilibrium, the marginal rate of technical substitution, MRTS, the rate you can swap one input for another without affecting output, needs to be the same for all firms and equal to the ratio of the prices of those inputs.
Okay, so it's like ensuring everyone's on the same page about how they use their inputs, and those choices align with input costs.
You got it. It's about finding that equilibrium where we're using our resources efficiently in both consumption and production.
This has been an incredible journey into general equilibrium. We've seen how markets are linked, how Pareto efficiency guides us toward optimal results, how market clearing keeps everything balanced, and how crucial efficient production is.
It has been a great exploration. It helps us see how those individual markets work together to determine what gets made, how it's made, and who gets those goods and services.
But what about those situations where markets don't achieve these perfect outcomes? When those efficient outcomes don't happen, what causes those market hiccups?
Great question. That brings us to market failure. A common cause of market failure is externalities.
Externalities, those are like the unintended consequences that impact people who aren't even directly involved.
Exactly. Externalities occur when the actions of one economic agent, a person, a company, a government, impact the well-being or production of others without any compensation.
I think I need an example here to really understand.
Imagine a factory making widgets, but as a byproduct, it also emits pollution into the air.
So the pollution, a negative externality, harms the people nearby.
Precisely. Those residents are paying the price for that pollution even though they aren't involved in making or buying those widgets.
It's like a hidden cost that's not included in the price.
Exactly. That's how externalities can lead to market failures. What's good for the factory making widgets and profit isn't necessarily good for society as a whole if you consider the pollution.
The market only sees the costs and benefits for the buyer and seller, not the bigger picture.
You got it. Now, there are negative externalities like pollution, which impose costs on others, and positive externalities, which create benefits for others.
So education is a positive externality. A well-educated population benefits everyone, not just the individuals getting educated.
Exactly. The point is that externalities, whether positive or negative, can mess up market outcomes and cause inefficiencies.
They're like glitches in the system.
That's a great way to put it. Negative externalities usually lead to too much production because the producers don't bear the full cost. They don't pay for that pollution, so they produce more than they should.
So the market makes too much of the bad stuff because producers aren't held accountable for the harm they cause.
Precisely. And the reverse is true for positive externalities. They can lead to underproduction because those creating the benefits aren't fully rewarded. Think of a company that develops a new vaccine. It benefits many more people than just those who buy it.
So we get too little of the good stuff because the incentives don't match the true social value.
Exactly. Now, we can visualize this with graphs. With a negative externality, the social marginal cost, SMC, which includes both the private cost and the external cost, is higher than the private marginal cost, PMC.
So the true cost to society is higher than what the producer sees.
Precisely. And with positive externalities, the social marginal benefit, SMB, is higher than the private marginal benefit, PMB.
The benefits to society are greater than what the individual consumer gets.
Exactly. Those mismatches between private and social costs and benefits lead to those inefficiencies we discussed.
Okay, so externalities are a problem, but what can we do about them? Can markets fix this themselves?
Well, a good example of what happens when externalities run wild is the tragedy of the commons.
The tragedy of the commons. That sounds intense. What is it?
It describes what happens when a shared resource like a pasture, a fishery, even the atmosphere is overused and eventually depleted because everyone's acting in their own self-interest without thinking about the long-term sustainability of the resource.
So everyone's thinking, if I don't take it, someone else will, and then they end up ruining it for everyone.
Exactly. Each person might be acting rationally, but collectively, their actions lead to a disastrous outcome.
So ignoring externalities can have some serious consequences. What can we do to fix these market failures?
There are a few approaches. One is private bargaining, explained by the Coase theorem. If property rights are clearly defined and negotiating isn't too costly, those involved can sometimes find a solution that addresses the externality without needing the government.
So in our pollution example, if the factory and residents can negotiate, they might find a way to reduce the pollution without the government getting involved.
Exactly. But in reality, those negotiations can be expensive, especially if many people are involved, making private bargaining less practical in many cases.
So if those private solutions aren't always feasible, what role can governments play in dealing with externalities?
Governments can step in with policies to address those market failures, things like taxes, subsidies, regulations, and tradable permits.
Okay, let's go through those. Taxes seem like a straightforward tool. How can taxes be used to deal with externalities?
One approach is Pigouvian taxes. These are taxes on activities that create negative externalities, like pollution.
So we tax the polluter to encourage them to clean up their act.
Exactly. Ideally, the tax equals the cost of the harm caused by the pollution. This aligns the private cost with the social cost, making polluters want to reduce their emissions to avoid that tax.
Okay, that makes sense. What about subsidies?
Subsidies are payments from the government to encourage things that create positive externalities, like education, renewable energy, or research.
So it's like a reward for good behavior.
You could say that. Subsidies lower the cost of production or increase consumer demand, leading to more of those beneficial activities.
So taxes discourage the bad and subsidies encourage the good. What about regulations?
Regulations are direct rules or standards imposed by governments. They could set limits on pollution levels, mandate safety features, or establish quality standards for products.
So setting clear rules to protect consumers and the environment.
Exactly. And lastly, there are tradable permits, also known as cap and trade systems. This approach sets a limit on the total amount of a certain activity, like pollution, and then creates a market for permits to engage in that activity.
So companies can buy and sell the right to pollute.
In a way, yes. The idea is to create an incentive for companies to reduce their emissions because they can sell their permits if they don't need them, or buy more if they need to pollute more.
So it's a market-based approach to reducing pollution. Interesting. Choosing the best policy depends on the situation and the costs and benefits of each approach.
Exactly. Each tool has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Wow, we've covered a lot today. We explored markets, supply and demand, consumer choices, production cost, market structures, game theory, general equilibrium, and even ways to address market failures like externalities. This has been an incredible journey through the world of microeconomics.
It really has. It's amazing to see how all these seemingly separate ideas connect and help us understand the complexities of economic behavior, markets, and the choices we make every day.
It's amazing how microeconomics really is everywhere, shaping so many aspects of our lives. I'm looking at the world through a whole new lens now.
That's great. And the best part is, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore in microeconomics. Hopefully this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you the foundation to continue learning and discovering.
Definitely. It's been a fascinating journey, and I'm excited to see what other economic mysteries I can unravel in the future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.